Hi everyone, BlondePhysicist here. Today we're going to go through how to get GPT to make and call its own Python functions. Here's a quick demo of what we can do with this. Okay, so first we just need to set up our OpenAI API key. If you don't already have one, you can go to this link to get one. Next, I'm going to go through an outline of what we're actually going to cover in this video. So first, we'll go through a basic example of OpenAI's new function call feature and what its capabilities are. Next, in part 2, we'll automate generating a JSON description of existing functions for GPT. So this just means that we won't need to write our functions twice, and it will also be useful when we get GPT to write its own functions later on. Part 3 will be getting GPT to make new functions, and part 4 will be getting GPT to use its own newly created functions. So here in this section, we're just going over the imports. This is everything we'll need to import for the video. These are the main imports that we'll be using, and the additional imports will come up later on. I'll indicate when they do. Here in part 1, we're going to go over this basic example. So we'll use this simple function as an example of a function that we want to get GPT to use. It takes a few different types of arguments, a string for sports, a list for team names, and an optional integer for number of results. This function will return a few, in this case, pre-prepared headlines based on what you ask for. So this is a function that we could use in Python, but now we need to convert it into a format that GPT has been trained to use. Here you can see that we've written a description of the above function in the format required by OpenAI when using their new function call feature. The information that you see in the docstring of this getSportsHeadlines function is basically the same as what you see here. So this means that we've actually had to write out the same information twice, but not to worry, we'll be automating this process shortly. Okay, so let's try this out. But before we try this with the new model incorporating the new function call feature, let's just see what the older version of GPT would have given us. Using the new model instead, we can now include a list of functions that the model has access to in order to help it generate its response. It's worth noting here that we're sending descriptions of the functions to the model, but not the actual functions themselves. So here we're including the function that it is allowed to use, and we're allowing it to choose whether it uses it or not. We're using the new model that came out June 13th, but we're still using GPT 3.5 instead of GPT 4. So this is a model that you'll definitely have access to. If you run this with a new model of GPT 4 instead, great, you'll get better results. Okay, so we get this chat completion response. We can see that GPT decided to make a function call, that's its finish reason. And like usual, the message came back from the assistant, but instead of there being any content, it's indicated that it wants to make the function call. It's specified here that it wants to call the function listed under name, and it describes the arguments that it wants to pass in. GPT also gives you a summary of the number of tokens used for the request. So you might notice that the prompt tokens number is higher than we might have expected given the content we provided. That's because the function description is included in the prompt tokens count. So this means that there's a limit to the number of functions that you can include in a single request. Now we need to do that function call. So first we extract the information returned by GPT. JSON loads the argument string as a dictionary. And based on those arguments, the function outputs the following. So this is what the model was asking for. Now we need to give that back to the model. We're building a message containing our function's response to return to GPT. GPT has been trained to expect responses from something called function, so it wants to know the name of the function that has responded to it. Next, we send a new message to GPT, including our original prompt, the model's request for a function call, and our function's response. You can see here that even though we still include a list of functions for GPT to have access to, this time it decides to give us an answer just from the context that it now has. We could also simply not have included a list of functions this time and saved ourselves some tokens. Getting into part 2, here we're going to automate generating a JSON description of existing functions for GPT. So this means that we won't need to write our functions twice, and also it will be useful when we get GPT to write its own functions. We'll be using these imports in this section, so here's just a quick example of how they can be used. Inspect is to see the source code of the function based on only the function itself, and callable is a type hint that lets us specify that we're expecting a function. So in order to automate generating a properly formatted description, since we want GPT to give a specific type of response, we'll use a system prompt to help us steer it. Here, we've written a system prompt where we're telling GPT what we want it to do. A couple of useful tips for this. Start by telling GPT its role in this instance, so converting a Python function into a JSON in a specific format. Next, rather than trying to explain what the specific form of this JSON actually looks like, in this case we're just going to give it an example. Finally, it's often helpful to emphasize key points at the end of the prompt, because with longer prompts like this, GPT can lose focus or start to ignore its earlier directions. Now we write a function that uses OpenAI's chat completion endpoint to perform this conversion for us. First, we get the code from our function. Here we specify the model and temperature to use. Just in case you don't already know, temperature is a knob that adjusts how deterministic the model outputs are over a range from 0 to 2, where 0 is deterministic and 2 is spicy. We also feed in our system prompt instructions and the function code we want to convert. Next, we extract the response. We convert it from a string to a dictionary and return our automated function description. We can test this out on the previous example function. So the new OpenAI function call feature combined with the above automation allows you to easily have GPT use existing Python functions. But now in part 3, we'll get GPT to write its own functions. For this section, we benefit from these few helper functions, which let us convert GPT's string response into a usable function. They're not the main focus of this video, so I won't go into detail about them. Just like before, when we used a system prompt to get GPT to write descriptions for us, here we're using a system prompt to get GPT to write its own functions. So we'll follow the same generally useful structure of tell GPT its role, in this case an expert Python coder, give GPT a description of what it should do, and provide examples. Okay, so of course there are all sorts of reasons to be flexible when following this structure guide. Sometimes you might skip the description and go straight to examples. And in this case, we're including a description, but we're not going to bother to include any examples. We're doing this because GPT is good at writing functions, and it really doesn't need any examples here. Next, we write a function that uses OpenAI's chat completion endpoint to make a new function given a function name, descriptions of the arguments, and a description of the function. We can test this out. Finally, in part 4, we can combine the ability to make functions and to automatically convert them into a description to allow the model to build and use its own functions when necessary. So in this case, we'll start with a much more generic role in our system prompt, and we'll give it some instructions, encouraging it to use functions when appropriate. We're also encouraging it not to hallucinate functions that it doesn't have access to. For example, GPT seems to be utterly convinced that it has access to a somewhat all-powerful function called Python, probably because such a function was present in a lot of the training data for this latest model. Finally, we encourage GPT to make new functions when one would be useful, rather than directly responding to the user. In this case, for this example, we're going to go through the back and forth with the LLM one step at a time. In step 1, we start off with only the one new function available, so this is our function that makes new functions. We make a user request, in this case, something that is easy but that GPT will struggle to do by itself. And we use OpenAI's chat completion endpoint to see what the LLM thinks it should do next. We see from this response that the LLM has decided to make a function call to make a new function that will multiply together all of the numbers of a given array. This makes sense. Now in step 2, we'll pass along that request to the make new function function. Now we'll add that new function along with the description of it to the dictionary of available functions that we provide to GPT. So let's quickly see the function that we just added. Okay, in step 3, we make the same request as before, but we include the updated list of available functions. This time, GPT requests that we use that new function. Now, we carry out the function call that GPT requested, and we see that the function output is a number and the correct answer. So we put that back into a form that GPT will understand, a response from a function. And finally, we call OpenAI's endpoint one last time, additionally providing it with GPT's request to call its new function and that function's response. And here, it gives us a final answer. Okay, so we've seen GPT make its own function and call its own function. If you want to go through this notebook yourself, you'll see that there's some additional code at the end that uses what we've talked about today to make the demo you saw at the beginning of this video. In the meantime, thank you so much for watching. Thanks for sticking with me until the end of the video, and I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you found it both useful and interesting, and if you did, please consider liking, subscribing, and commenting below.